Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. I wanted to do a bit of a think piece today as a couple of game announcements and reveals have come along that have got me thinking of a particular favourite topic of mine, the topic of transgression and how it applies to video games. There have been a couple of examples in just the last week of trailers and demos for games that will certainly be chalked up as some of the more extreme examples of transgression across the video game industry. One is Succubus, the action follow-up to Agony from a few years ago, and the other is Lust from Beyond, a sequel to the Lovecraftian and Eyes Wide Shut homage, Lust for Darkness. Both of these games are almost certainly going to cause offence in some quarters, even putting aside the quality of the gameplay, and given how Agony turned out, I wouldn't be expecting too much from Succubus. Both of these games are going to receive criticism on the basis of their themes. Now, I would argue that they don't seem to be that transgressive in comparison to what we see in some other media. Their predecessors certainly weren't, and these games only seem to be an extension on what the ideas of the original games were about. So it's not because they were extreme, and they are certainly that they're not transgressive. It's more because they're extreme without the context that is so important to create something that is truly transgressive. To understand this, we need to understand what transgression really is, and there's a couple of useful philosophers out there to help us with that. One is Georges Bataille, and apologies for my butchering of the French name, I've never been able to pronounce his name properly with my Australian accent. He wrote extensively on the subject, using Marquis de Sade as a muse. The best book to check out on the subject is simply called Eroticism. The main point of that is that transgression does two things. It exceeds the boundaries of the taboo subject, and then, critically, it not only exceeds the taboo, but it also completes it. To put it in another way, and to paraphrase a core argument being made here, transgression is inherently self-aware. It breaks the taboo in order to enter into a discussion about the nature of that taboo. It explores why it is a taboo, and it makes a point of that taboo. Sade is actually a really good example of doing just that. Sade wrote pornography, but it was never just that. His writings were also very revolutionary in spirit. They were an attack on the church and on the state, and he deliberately broke through taboos as much as a metaphor for the hypocrisy, lack of true accountability, and decadence of those in power, as they were pornographic in nature. Another philosopher, Michel Foucault, further built on this idea, pointing out the reciprocal relationship between the taboo and the transgression with this quote: "A limit could never exist if it were absolutely uncrossable, and, reciprocally, transgression would be pointless if it merely crossed the limit comprised of illusions and shadows." I would argue that many of the video games that we play and get chalked up as transgressive are merely the latter. They're illusions and shadows. They're not crossing hard taboos, but rather the safe ones that can be crossed without really, truly making anybody uncomfortable. Succubus, and Agony before it, are certainly extreme experiences, but by nature extreme experiences make some people offended. But is this any more than a vivid rendering of Dante's Inferno from over 500 years ago? And is it really transgressive to depict hell as hell across all of society? I would argue not. Is it offensive? Potentially, sure, to some, but depictions of hell are firmly off the table as taboo subjects. Hollywood and plenty of other video games have used the exact same material for their own work. It's just that this particular game sits on the hard edge of the spectrum by being that much more extreme. It's a similar story to Lust from Beyond. Sexualized imagery in aliens-like science fiction is closer to the norm than anything transgressive. Lust from Beyond and Lust for Darkness before that may well be much further down the path and may do a lot more with that subject in terms of the visual imagery and the extremeness of it all, but they're not really breaking from what is quite conventional. Part of the problem is that we too often equate transgression with of causing offence, and that isn't really what transgression is about. It certainly can be, and Sade is a great example of that, being both offensive and transgressive, but they're not synonyms as terms. Transgression is a challenge to what is known and accepted, and in terms of, it's a challenge to where the limits about discourse are. And crossing over a boundary to challenge that is where transgression comes from. in which we are forced to acknowledge the existence of the taboo and question its purpose. None of that in any way insists on it also being offensive in the process. See, the reality is that video game developers are very, very reticent to actually do transgression. Some video game developers find the commercial and artistic appeal in causing offense because that is a very valid and potentially lucrative community of people who will then buy the game because they enjoy the extreme and the offensive. But to be genuinely transgressive is quite another matter, since transgression is more about drawing people into spaces where they are uneasy and reflective, and unease and reflection are much less effective bullet points on a press release. It's also worth noting that genuine transgression is not built out of an inherent sense of fun. Transgression is too reflective for that, and that does tend to be a big sticking point for video games above a certain size. There's even a book that acknowledges this, called The Paradox of Transgression in Games, which realizes that in being transgressive, these video games go beyond the standard boundaries of entertainment. Now, that book has a much lower threshold to what it considers to be taboo than I would necessarily agree with. It does include extreme violence, for example, and it does mistake controversy such as Mortal Kombat as the equivalent to the kind of thematic awareness of Assad's book, but it does nonetheless highlight the challenge in representing transgression within video games as the only artistic medium where there isn't that same tolerance for the idea that art doesn't exist exclusively for the purposes of pleasure. Video games, there is that expectation that fun and entertainment are the primary drivers of the medium. With any other art form, that is not the inherent case. That's not to say that transgressive games do not exist. It's just that if you want to wade through, it's just that you'll need to wade through itch.io looking for them rather than Steam or a major console. It's also not to say that a game might not have subversive ideas while not being transgressive. You can be subversive or critical of a theme or topic or message without being transgressive of it. And subversion in itself is an important and valuable tool for storytelling and for video games. There are plenty of examples of very good subversive games out there. However, it is worth noting that when people talk about transgression in games, they're generally looking at what the marketers would want you to believe is transgressive, and a lot of the time that is just mild subversion. And as we've discussed on this channel in the past, we really shouldn't let marketers define things. If we're going to talk about transgression in video games, then we need to talk about transgression as a proper topic, as a thing that is distinct from being subversion, and what that means for the video game and what the video game is trying to tell us. Anyhow, that is enough for this video. If you are a fan of the transgressive and the challenging, sound out in the comments. If you've got any recommendations for games that you feel are transgressive, I would love to chat with you about them. So please do drop us a note and let's talk about your favorite transgressive games. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos, and if you would consider throwing me $1 or $2 on Patreon in support of what I'm doing, that would be a huge help in helping this channel to grow and do more things. But yeah, otherwise, thank you very much as always for watching, and I will see you at the next video.